All right, so ran into some technical difficulties there. All right, there we go. Technical difficulties aside, we'll dispense with the pleasantries, as they say, and just dig right in. I will stop sharing my screen from time to time so that I have an opportunity to take questions in real time. I realize that this wasn't for marks. That does not mean that it's not important. And I realize on the one hand, especially in this day and age of AI and just asking the internet everything, it would be very easy to, just sort of leave your test is the wrong word, leave your assessment blank and then just sort of like fill it in now or just copy off somebody else, because then it's complete and then it looks done with all the right answers. My encouragement for you for actual learning is that if you're not taking the time to try to challenge yourself with these questions, if you're not challenging yourself with the material, sort of trying to search and find, and to really try to understand the material rather than just copying stuff down, it will get to the point where it doesn't really resonate in your brain. It's just going to seem like a bunch of words. And then when you're asked questions that are more nuanced or are a little bit more complex or ask you to, think critically about how some of these things are put together, if all you're doing is just memorizing answers that someone else has written down, you're really going to be at a loss. And so you are, sort of sacrificing long-term learning for the sake of just sort of short-term completion. So I realize our time is short, and I'm not here to preach at you. I am here to, type answers kind of as I go. And I will be posting this. So yes, you will have access to this later. As unrefined as these live streams are, they do provide, a record of what's happened. And that can have some degree of usefulness. But obviously the hope is that, when I am able to return, we are able to have real discussions and conversations, especially about, real cases, why they matter. If you found this first assessment easy, if you're like, oh man, I didn't even need the textbook, or then, hey, that's great. If there was some stuff in here, you're like, oh man, I don't really remember doing some of this in, civics or earlier years. Either way, my encouragement is to not coast, because this is a fairly straightforward introductory chapter, just laying the foundation. As we move into stuff like criminal law, that's where there needs to be a little bit more of, thinking, application, etc. So without any further delay, we are going to take this up. Canada is a democratic nation. How does a representative democracy function? We know, of course, it's not a direct democracy. This is where citizens elect representatives to debate and make laws on their behalf. Canadians do not vote on laws directly. Now, you didn't even have to say that last statement, but I'm putting it in there because it's true. I know that when I had a follow-up with one of the other live streams, one of the takeaways from the class was, we prefer to have something in the way of, notes. And so that's why I'm typing. I'm giving it to you. Feel free to do with it as you wish. So citizens elect representatives to debate and make laws on their behalf. Canadians do not vote on laws directly. There's a follow-up question in here that talks about the different levels of government, so I'm not going to talk about that now, but we do have different levels of representatives. MPs at the federal level, MPPs at the provincial level, town councillors at the municipal level. So we can move on there. Contrast rules and laws. Again, rules apply to participants for a period of time, whereas laws apply to all people all the time. Laws are more important than rules. And the reason why I put that in there, it's just asking me to do period for a period I like of time. If somebody says, well, you need to break the law, that's just the way, that's the rules of the game, that's just how this works, then I wouldn't participate in that, because you can get yourself into a lot of very real trouble if you're breaking actual laws. So, breaking rules, I don't advocate for that either. But again, it very much depends on whether or not you want to be a part of the organization. Because the impact can also, sometimes there may not be an actual, I am going to preach at you a little bit. Let's talk about golf. Let's talk about people lying in golf and cheating. If you cheat when you play golf, you might not even get caught necessarily. You're cheating yourself. And if people do catch you cheating, you're not necessarily going to go to jail or be sued or anything like that, but you might break relationship, and people may not want to be in relationship with you. I know that the King Solomon, especially in Proverbs, he talks about how a good name is better than riches. To be respected is better than gold. So, sometimes it can seem, like it's worth it to maybe sacrifice your integrity for a quick buck, or just because you really want to win. And I'm here to encourage you that your integrity is much more important and much more valuable in the long run. So take that as you will. But also pointing out here, even though laws are more important than rules, and laws apply to all citizens at all times, if there are restrictions, get the right permissions. We're going to talk about that in criminal law, because there are things that I can do. For example, I've already mentioned the motorcycle. I can legally operate a motorcycle. I've gone through the proper steps in order to be licensed to do that. That doesn't mean that we live in an unjust society where, I get to do something and you don't, and, you are being held back from doing the things that you will also have the opportunity to go through that process. So that's actually not, what would be considered unjust discrimination, because there's limitations on, for example, when you can get your license, when you can vote, etc. So what are the two primary functions of the law? If I were to put this into 4 words: maintain order and to protect rights and freedoms. And it's a delicate balancing act. As simple as this seems, oh, okay, good, there you go. There are constant debates and conversations about how much power should the government have in order to maintain order. That's actually, and if we want to talk about something very much in the news right now, it was horrific, the footage that came out of the fact that that Charlie Kirk was assassinated yesterday. Absolutely, graphically gunned down. And he was a controversial figure, because he wanted to have those debates, right? The whole idea of like, what is actually the role of government? How much government is too much? What should the government be doing? And I don't want to make this overly ideological right now, but this is one of the biggest arguments, I would say, political arguments, in the United States, in Canada, in the world today. What is the role of government? Is the government there to run the economy and, provide unlimited social services? Or is the government better if it is smaller and not given the power and authority to overstep into the lives of individual citizens? Where do we draw the line of government power? And so we're going to unpack that actually quite a bit as we look into Chapter 2. We look at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We're going to be looking at something called the Reasonable Limits Clause. I'm actually going to write this down. Reasonable Limits Clause. And you probably didn't see that in this chapter. If you had me for civics, you may remember hearing about that. And if I was to summarize the Reasonable Limits Clause in the Charter, it basically says you have rights, but you cannot use your rights to infringe upon the rights of others. And, we are going to be looking at the nature, for example, of free speech and the importance of that. And, there's a difference between being offended and actually having your rights infringed upon. And because that was actually a big part of, sometimes why Charlie Kirk became such a controversial figure, because yes, he would, talk with people, and there were people that would often want to, fight him. I see there's tons of reels online right now where people are ready to fight him, and he's like, I'm not going to fight you. We're not going to turn this into a fist fight, because it's not about that. It's about, you can debate, ideas. We can have a conversation. And so, sometimes people do want to use violence in order to silence people. I don't like what it is you've had to say, so I want the government to step in and censor you or to silence you. This goes back to what I was saying before, the issue of maintaining order and protecting rights and freedoms. When do you draw the line? Because I will say this, and this was a famous Supreme Court justice in the United States who said this, even the strictest free speech believer would say that it's not okay for you to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Like, you can't go in there and abuse your freedom of expression to lie and cause havoc. Although people have tried to do that, right? People will be like, well, it's just a prank, bro. And then people have actually been injured because somebody was, taking what they thought were their rights too far. This is often why we have the courts, right? We're not going to answer all of these things here today, but if I don't like what somebody has to say, I can be offended. I have the right to respond back, but I couldn't, for example, respond with violence and be like, well, because I didn't like what you said, I'm going to punch you in the face. And, that's my right. That's how I express myself. No, there are limitations. And often the courts are there to try to determine, has somebody crossed the line? We were talking about this when we got a lot of questions about home ownership, or rather, I should say, protecting your home. And what if somebody, is trespassing on your property? What do you have the right to do? And this is where we get into substantive versus procedural law, which is actually a perfect, way for us to take up this question. What's the difference between substantive and procedural law? Why are both important? And again, we see the word substance and we see the word process or procedure. Substance is where your rights and freedoms live, so to speak. The essence of the law and what it represents. And the fact that you have the right to protect yourself and your property, it's written law. Like it has been documented. If someone was like, on what authority do you have, you could reference the Constitution, you could reference the criminal code. So I'm not sure if my wife made it into the live stream back there. You're there for all time. No, that's fine. Wave, say hi to the kids. No? Okay. No. Oh, is it here? Are these your sunglasses? No? These are the cheap ones we got from, well, this is in the live stream forever. But it makes it more human, that's for sure. Just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that you can enforce that however you want. That's where procedural law comes in, the step-by-step process of enforcing your rights. And I'm not saying you have to be a lawyer, but I do like the expression, when in doubt, don't. And what I mean by that is I'm not saying give up on your dreams. That's not what that means. But the idea of when in doubt, don't means if you don't think that you're permitted to do something, if you're like, I'm not sure, that seems maybe, it might be a good idea for you to ask some questions to somebody who actually knows, rather than just being like, well, I mean, I didn't know. Because at a certain point, there's another saying that ignorance of the law is no excuse, especially when you're an adult, when you don't have the same protections under the law that you have now. It's your job to find out what the laws are and to act accordingly. You can't just be like, well, nobody told me. It's like, well, guess what? That's part of the trade-off of having freedom, is you have to sometimes do some homework. You have to figure out what the consequences might be. That's why they often talk about, being an adult sometimes seems like a trap, because, you grow up and you realize, hey, I could have ice cream sandwiches for breakfast every day. No one's stopping me. You're right, you could, but there's going to be consequences for that particular choice. And, it is going to dramatically impact your health. And you can't just be, well, I didn't know. You're like, well, you're an adult. Like you have to figure this stuff out. Like, read and follow the label, check out the nutritional content, talk to somebody, right? You don't have to be an expert in everything. I sometimes like to change the expression, when in doubt, don't. So like, when in doubt, ask. And in fact, I'm going to write that down right here. When in doubt, ask. It's better to have a conversation with someone, rather than, just jumping right into it and possibly making the situation worse. So Both of these are incredibly important. Substantive law gives you the right to do something, whereas procedural law is how you go about doing it. And again, they're equally important, because if you just decide you want to try to, set up a whole bunch of booby traps on your front lawn because you don't like it when your neighbor's dog, walks on your front lawn, so you're going to buy, army surplus landmines and put them on your lawn and be like, it's my property, I can do what I want. No, that again, actually, if I can scroll up, goes back to this reasonable limits clause. You do have rights, but you cannot use your rights to infringe upon the rights of others. It's also especially important. I'm going to write this in here too, not that it was a part of this specific question, but different countries have different laws. So what might be permitted in one country may not be permitted in another country. And we're going to see this especially when we look into firearms ownership, firearms laws, and the massive disconnect between Canada and the United States when it comes to that conversation. But that will be at another time. That will be in criminal law. So speaking of criminal law, why is criminal law considered public law and civil law is considered private law? Well, criminal law impacts society as a whole. And I had mentioned this earlier, it's sort of the ripple effect, right? It doesn't mean that every single time a crime is committed that you feel the direct impact, but there's really been, especially with increased home invasions, vehicle thefts, etc., if you were to take the pulse of the average Canadian right now, do you feel safer or do you feel less safe in Canada than you did 10, 15 years ago? The growing pulse in Canada is that people are feeling less safe as a whole. They're feeling as though crime is going unchecked, and that, dangerous criminals seem to just be walking the streets. Why are we letting people out on bail? That's subject to bail reform. And, we had a bit of a conversation last week about that. So criminal law impacts society as a whole. And you have to think about it. When a suspected criminal is brought to trial in a criminal case, the suspect is being put on trial by society. And that is actually what the Crown prosecutor represents. In the American equivalent is what's called the district attorney. But the Crown prosecutor, their society is putting this person on trial, saying, and again, going back to, the criminal code, and we were talking about that in an earlier lesson, we as a society have deemed the following things to be unacceptable behaviors, things like murder, theft, etc. We feel as though we have sufficient evidence to show that you have committed a crime. You have broken this social contract. You have committed acts that society says are unacceptable, that are criminal. And if you are found guilty for having committed these acts, we as a society have deemed that there are consequences for breaking those laws, because that's the only way that we can maintain order, right? We cannot allow crimes to just occur without there being some sort of consequence for it. Because actually, that's sort of what we see sometimes when crimes go unpunished, then it emboldens criminals to just be able to say, so nothing's going to happen. Oh, okay, well then I guess I'm not going to change my behavior. Whereas if we look at civil law is about disputes between if I could spell individuals or groups of individuals. Wow, I cannot spell. Individuals. There we go. Yeah, it doesn't have to be one single person versus another single person. Sometimes you'll have a single person against like a company, or you'll have, in the case of, sometimes they call it a class action lawsuit, you will have numerous plaintiffs that are suing, an organization. And that can be, there've been historic settlements that have been reached between, cigarette companies and some of the people who have, been smoking for a long. And you might be like, well, isn't that a personal choice? And yeah, people make choices, but there was a time actually when there were no warning labels on cigarettes, and in fact, there was a whole bunch of, trying to hide the evidence, the medical evidence, to the fact of how dangerous and how bad smoking was. It's wild, actually, if you go back in time, to the 1930s and 40s even, you'd hear radio ads for cigarettes, but also saying like, more doctors recommend this particular one, because it's healthier. And, there was actually, I'm not even making this up, there was an ad, for asbestos cigarette filters, designed to, and if you know anything about asbestos, it's one of the most, hazardous, into your lungs. And I don't want to get sidetracked here, because laws also change as scientific evidence adapts and grows, and as we learn more things, then sometimes changes happen. Ask your parents about when they were kids and whether or not they had car seats. I bet you, especially based on the age of your kids, the age of your parents, there was probably a time where your parents would like walk around in the back seat, completely not even seatbelts on. And I'm not actually here to confuse you about this. I want to backtrack that. That would actually be more under, again, the issue of, criminal law, right? How, as we as a society learn and grow, and laws will change over time as well. So yeah, not here to confuse you. Civil law is about disputes between individuals or groups of individuals. Let's say a contractor, you pay them to do a job and then they don't. And you're like, well, I'm dissatisfied with this. You took my deposit. You didn't do the job. It's not theft, right? It's not a crime, but it is a breach of contract. And that might then be something where you have to go through the courts. I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment. Again, checking in the chat to see if there's any questions thus far. I don't see any. That's fine. I'll go back to what I was doing before, but please feel free to put those in there as we continue. This was open. There are lots of different things you could have said here. There isn't one answer to this. I know just a few of them. For example, if you were to talk about the Code of Hammurabi, that was the one you could have written down. Even though we don't use the actual Code of Hammurabi, like we would look at it, we would say, whoa, those are super harsh. We don't use those laws today. You're right, we don't. But the format of a code, that is something that has remained, right? If you do this, this is what happens. Many nations around the world use a criminal code as a means of educating the public. So yeah, I mean, Code of Hammurabi, which I can't spell. Let's see if even Hammurabi. There we go. Code of Hammurabi. We have a criminal code today. Another example that you could have used, it talked about Mosaic law. And this is actually really a neat one to unpack, especially in a Christian school. And there will be many devotions that we'll have about this subject, because when we look at Mosaic law in the Torah, it goes much deeper than the Ten Commandments. It gets into the book of Leviticus. They have all sorts of laws surrounding purity laws, dietary restrictions, etc. And, the Pharisees were these experts in Mosaic law. So Mosaic Law, 10 Commandments. If you look at the 10 Commandments, specifically, when we get into, obviously the first one, you might say, like, isn't there a little bit of a, I don't want to say a contradiction, but on the one hand, if you look at, the first commandment in the 10 Commandments, which is, you shall have no other gods before me. You might look at that and be like, what about religious freedom? Don't we live in a country where people are allowed to make their own decisions and you don't have to be of faith if you don't want to be? You're absolutely right. Okay, so I want to be careful here. I am not saying that in Canada that we are bound by Mosaic law. But if you look into the 10 Commandments, especially for that early civilization, and Francis Chan actually gives a good video that sort of talks about this, the idea of society being better when it's not okay for you to just go out and kill people or take other people's stuff. The idea of don't steal from people, don't murder other people, don't spread false testimony about people, just to name a few. Those are takeaways that we would say as a society today. Yes, that's important. Individual people have rights, and those shouldn't be taken from them. So we'll unpack that in more degree, because again, Jesus had a lot to say about the Pharisees who felt as though they were holy because of their adherence to the law. And also, if you really want to get into it, the Apostle Paul, thankful for us as Christians, we are not bound by Mosaic law in the same way. Like Paul talks about that quite a bit, where he says, the law, Mosaic law doesn't save people. If anything, you look back on it and you'd see that nobody could keep it. Everybody would break it. If anything, it was to point out the fact that we need a savior. And that's the beauty of the gospel. The whole idea of, you're right, you can't keep all of this. We need a savior. And so, Paul talks about the new covenant under Christ and what it means to follow Christ and what that looks like. And it's not about specifically a legal system. It's about, God's kingdom being about trying to follow Jesus and to, as Jesus said, to sum up the commandments, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. What does that look like? But another one I'm going to throw in here before we move on, because I know it's 3:00 and we have a few more questions to get through. Roman law. The Romans, we actually owe them for Latin, the language, Latin. And we don't speak Latin these days, at least not in everyday conversation. There's a certain irony that the word vernacular, which actually means sort of common people speak, that's actually a Latin word. But you'll find, just like in science, like biology, etc., there's a lot of Latin phrases we're going to be unpacking. I know we had one a little bit earlier. We looked at the concept of habeas corpus, which is a Latin term. It's tied to, the idea of the right to face your accusers. So a lot of Latin shows up because it's a very precise language. And also the Romans were one of the first societies to actually have, being a lawyer as a profession. That could be how you made your living, being an expert in the law. So I'm not going to go too much more into that, because we have a few things to get through before we wrap up today. So what's the difference between case law and statute law? How does Canada use both simultaneously? Well, remember, case law is recorded decisions from earlier trials. Judges would make decisions that could be here's this word again, precedent. Ooh, that's a $10 word for future decisions. How did we handle this before? And again, this gets back into English common law. I'd very much encourage you to go back into section 1.5. Case law is about studying old cases for a judge's decision. You're seeking precedent. Is there something in this case that you can show a judge and say, well, Your Honor, in an earlier case, this judge made this decision, and we think that this should impact your decision? That's the concept of precedent, and that's what case law is actually all about. How does this differ from statute law? Statute law is laws passed by a governing body. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, the fact that Canadians elect lawmakers to debate and vote on laws. And, you know, a perfect example of statute law, the Canadian Criminal Code is statute law. Okay, these are laws that have been passed by a governing body. They are firm laws that are written down. They go through the process of bill to law, which is a follow-up question, right? The idea of, you know, members of parliament, you know, voting it through, being passed to the Senate, it passing the Senate, then receiving royal assent. How then is this different from, or how do we use both of these? It's a bit of a hybrid type situation where judges must consider both the criminal code and case law precedent when determining an appropriate sentence. Because often the way that this would work is that you have something that happens, we don't have a law surrounding it, so, you know, the judges would make a decision, and, you know, that's the idea of common law. Eventually, for the sake of clarity, we can pass that on to Parliament and say, Parliament, you need to do something with this. You need to now, like, put this into the criminal code so that moving forward we have clarity. And, you know, judges must consider both the criminal code and precedent when determining an appropriate sentence, because there's so many things that you have to look at, not just what does the criminal code say, but you could look at what is the age of the offender. Do they have a previous criminal record? You know, did they plead guilty? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's actually both of these things need to be considered, and we do use them simultaneously. What are the levels of the Canadian government? In short, federal, provincial, and municipal. Where do they get the power? The Constitution. And I asked you to watch that video about Canada's sort of weird constitution and sort of the origins of it, because history does matter. You know, this just didn't come from nowhere. You know, you go far enough back, and that's one of the reasons why I actually like looking at words. Where did this word originate from? What are the origins of the word? It actually will often tell you a story. And that can help to provide some context for, like, oh, that's why it is the way that it is. But these are the levels of the Canadian government. In fact, if you want to get technical, not in the Constitution. I think you're old enough that we can have a conversation now about the often fracas relationship between municipalities and the province. Because even though in grade 10 civics, I told you about the 3 levels of government, and yes, it's true, they do exist. Provinces actually have jurisdictional authority over a lot of municipal borders and boundaries. And that can create all sorts of tension. Because sometimes, you know, the province, if they really, really wanted to, can sort of redraw municipal boundaries. Now, you might ask, well, why don't they? Again, you have to remember, politicians are elected by the people, so you don't want to make people too upset because you're afraid of potentially losing your jobs and not being voted back. But there was actually a few years ago where the province was toying around with the idea of making, in Halton region, which is Oakville, Burlington, and Milton, actually amalgamating them into one city, the city of Halton. So there would be no Oakville, there would be no Burlington, there would be no Milton. It would just be Halton City. And there was a huge pushback from that in all of the municipalities that said, no, 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 that is not the answer. We don't want that. And we don't have to get into the specifics, but the province backed off because they're like, okay, we don't want to, commit, as the saying would be, political suicide in doing something that makes the public so upset that then our political party, gets destroyed at the next election. But provinces do have a lot of power and jurisdiction when it comes to municipal politics. We're actually going to talk about that in Chapter 2 when we look at something in the Constitution known as the Notwithstanding Clause, but that's another conversation for another day. Steps to pass a federal law. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Only going to point out that now there are 343 MPs. This is up from 338. Okay, there are 343 MPs, and I have a whole separate lesson where I walk you through the process of the bill entering the House of Commons. There being 3 separate readings. Majority support is required. It then moves to the Senate, where we repeat the process. Once it passes the Senate, it receives royal assent from the Governor General. The only thing I'll say about this is by the time it makes it to the Governor General, they are essentially a ceremonial, symbolic figurehead. They do not have any decision-making power. Mary Simon, our current Governor General as of 2025, when this was recorded, she can't really be like, I don't know. I don't really like this law. Maybe I'm not going to sign it. She actually doesn't have the constitutional authority to just ignore it or say, nah, I don't want to sign it. She's actually bound by the Constitution to fulfill that obligation. And someone had asked me before, what if the Governor General doesn't want to do their job? Well, then there would be a challenge to that in which another Governor General would essentially be instated. And we sort of almost had that a few years ago with former Governor General Julie Payette, who now she wound up resigning, but on paper, she seemed to be, a good pick for Governor General. She was an accomplished astronaut. She was, bilingual, from the province of Quebec, scientist, very well, respected in her field. But she was actually a terrible Governor General because the sort of things that made her a great scientist and astronaut, she didn't really like being around people. She didn't really like doing the pomp and circumstance and the shaking of hands and the various other stuff. She's like, nah, I don't want to do it. And the reason why there was pushback was because this is literally your job. Like, that is the job. You got to go around and do this. And she's like, yeah, well, how about I just don't? And then it really became, by some reports, a hostile working environment. And eventually, she wound up just resigning from it, which was then, so she didn't have to be forcefully removed. She wound up resigning. And then now Mary Simon is in her place, but again, does not have any formal decision-making power. If you have any questions on this, again, I would watch the earlier video I posted on it. Why would a country willingly agree to follow international laws if they have sovereignty on their own territory? Alliances have major benefits. And not just for protection in the case of something like, for example, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's not just about, protection in a war. It can also be to build trading alliances. Because if you have a strong, resilient trade with other countries, That can be good for the economy. Even traveling back and forth, even from a tourism standpoint, if you have a good relationship with another country, if you don't have restrictions on travel, you might be surprised to find that there's actually a lot of passports that are somewhat limited. That if you have a passport from some countries, there are countries that will turn you away. You might be like, whoa, that sounds like discrimination. Well, you have to also understand countries do have the right to enforce their own laws. And if there is tension between countries at the international level, you do not have, and I want to say this, you do not have the right to go visit another country to which you are not a member. If you're a Canadian citizen, you have the right to be in Canada. You have the right to move around Canada. You have the right to leave Canada. But if you are wanting to visit another country, and for whatever reason, they decide to turn you away, you do not have the right to enter another country, just because you're a citizen of Earth, so to speak. And again, this will be a part of a larger conversation too when we look into the issue of, extradition treaties, and we'll look at things like immigration, the legal immigration, illegal immigration, some of the political challenges surrounding that. I actually also did post a video that fairly recently that sort of talks again about the United Nations and thinking of countries as sort of neighbors on a street, and why following international law will have benefit. No one says you have to do it, but it's one of the ways that you to use expression, get a seat at the table. If you want to be taken seriously, if you want people to do business and trade with you, following international law is a really good way to build those relationships. Now, again, and this is again, where if you look at superpowers, like if you look at Russia, if you look at China, if you look at the United States, often you'll see them sort of being like, hey, how about I just kind of do what I want? And the reality is, if you are big and powerful enough, you're sort of almost betting on the fact that, well, nobody's going to stop me because I'm so big and so powerful that, people aren't really going to do much about it. And it sort of becomes a bit of a sort of a national flex to be able to just like, well, yeah, I mean, I know I'm breaking international law, but like, what are you going to do? You going to stop me? I didn't think so. Are there alternatives to taking someone to court? Yes, there are. In fact, I would argue don't take someone to court if you don't have to. Try to negotiate if possible. Now, someone had asked me in the past, I know we're almost out of time here, is this question referring to criminal law or civil law? And I suppose that that's a good question, because if we talk about taking someone to court, that implies civil law. Because if it was criminal law, you don't take someone to court, okay? In criminal law, you don't take someone to court. Police may lay charges, but you as an individual person, it's not up to you to decide whether or not this becomes a case. Now, obviously, you could lay charges, you could call the police and all that sort of stuff. But it's in criminal law, it's not up to you to decide how to deal with things, for example, taking the law into your own hands. That would actually breach procedural law. What is habeas corpus? How is it connected to the presumption of innocence? Again, the Latin term habeas corpus is your right to face your accusers, which is your right to a trial. And this is actually a really big deal because historically, people would, and I said this in an earlier video, sometimes people would just be arrested and kind of thrown in a dungeon and never really get a trial. Like maybe it was like, hey, you got the wrong guy, or it doesn't matter. You've been locked up. You never saw the light of day again. What happened to that guy? Oh, I don't know. Like, well, where is he? I don't know. It's not like there was any paperwork, right? People would, in many cases, just be sort of locked up and never see the light of day ever again. And they never even got a trial to determine whether or not they were innocent or guilty. So this is a very big deal. You know, your right to face your accusers is habeas corpus. And the idea of presumption of innocence is you are considered innocent until proven guilty, you know, at trial. And that's why it's so important. So I'm going to start this sharing now. What is a plaintiff? A plaintiff is the person who is deciding to sue. If you are the one who is like, I want to sue this person, I'm filling out the paperwork, that's a plaintiff. So it's 3/19, it's Friday. I know everyone is eager to get a jump start on the weekend. I'm going to be posting this. We are done with chapter 1. Okay, if you have questions, you can email me if you didn't get a chance. But we are moving on. So the expectation, it's not homework or anything like that, but the idea is that we are now like moving on. So if you have questions about chapter 1, please make sure you send it to me. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you at some point next week, either remotely or in person. We'll see how things go. Godspeed.